Hey friends! My name is Danny, and this is Ale and Agony. How are ya? Welcome on in. Let's get cozy and talk about murder. And I just wanted to say thank you for your patience. This was meant to be out on Wednesday. It's currently Friday. It's 10:15 in the evening. I will get this edited and up before midnight if it kills me. So thank you so much. This case is long. There's a lot going on, and it just took much more time to look into than what I anticipated. So I hope that you enjoy it. So let's start with the drink rather than the ale of this week's episode. I'm actually drinking a can of Austin's Summer Punch with lemonade. Ooh la la. So get yourself cozy, because I'll be telling you about the case of Paul Ingram, the Thurston County ritual abuse case, and the questionable nature of recovered memories. So let's crack it open. Paul Ingram was the Chief Civil Deputy of the Sheriff's Department of Thurston County, Washington. He was also the county Republican chairman and a member of the local Pentecostal church, and was therefore a very well-known member of his community. So when his daughter Erica came forward and told her tale of a horrific satanic sexual abuse at the hands of her father, the community was stunned. Erica's mum and dad, Sandy and Paul, had met each other in 1964 at Spokane Community College in Washington. They were both working to pay their way through college. Sandy was working as a part-time maid and Paul was a janitor at a local dairy plant. Both of them were said to be super religious, but these naughty little sausages were having sex before marriage. From their third date onwards, to be exact, and when Sandy consequently fell pregnant less than 5 months after they met, they decided it would be best to make things official and tie the knot. After the birth of their son, Paul started thinking about his career and took up a job as a building supervisor. And then Sandy was pregnant again. This time it was twin girls, Erica and Andrea. But unfortunately, Andrea would be diagnosed with spinal meningitis and would later be institutionalized by the family as they just couldn't cope with her dependencies. 4 years after they met in 1968, their family continued to grow when Sandy gave birth to their second son. And now, with 4 children to look after, they decided it was time to find a larger home and a more stable job for Paul. So they chose Olympia in East Washington. 2 more years passed, and in 1970, Sandy gave birth to baby Julie, and Paul started a new career in the Thurston County Sheriff's Office. Despite Paul's brief affair with another woman, he says he was happy in his marriage to Sandy and talked openly about the sexual charge between the two of them. Did you know that they had sex every other day and also slept naked on a waterbed? I mean, why the affair when you have a waterbed wife right at home? Despite their obvious love and passion for each other, they were cold and unloving towards their children. And in 1978, their 6th and final child was born, a baby boy called Mark. So the years go by. Erica is now 22 years old and still living at home. She's described as being confident, she's outgoing, she loves to travel, she's been to Greece and Korea, and she's said to be the beauty of the family and loved fashion. On the other hand, her younger 18-year-old sister Julie, who she shared a bedroom with, was the absolute opposite of Erica. She was very quiet, she was a homebody, and she had won the state championship in the Future Homemakers of America contest 2 years in a row. This case started when Erica and her sister Julie went on their annual trip to the Bible camp in the summer of 1988, which was sponsored by their church. It was called the Heart to Heart Camp, where Erica was now a counsellor and helping young girls through their teenage years. 5 years previously, Erica had opened up to one of the counsellors at the Heart to Heart camp. It was about an attempted rape by her father's colleague, Jim Raby. This was of course investigated by the police, and it was found that there was no evidence to back up Erica's claims. Jim had placed his hand on her knee during a car ride home, which, in my opinion, is inappropriate and a little bit sleazy, but very different to attempted rape. 2 years after Erica made that claim against Jim Raby, they were back at the camp, and this time, younger sister Julie made an accusation against their neighbour. Paul, of course, also took this accusation very seriously, took Julie to the police to file an official complaint. But Julie decided that she didn't want to pursue the charges after her story started to become inconsistent, and so those charges were also dropped. So we're back in 1988, where 22-year-old Erica and 18-year-old Julie are at the Heart to Heart camp. And this is where Carla Franco was a guest speaker for the young girls. Carla was well known for having a close connection to God, and she would tell her fellow Christians that God was speaking to her and relay his messages, and she believed that she could perform spiritual healings. Carla was well known as previous to her public speaking career, she had appeared on television and several sitcoms and adverts. So she was pretty much a minor celebrity that the young girls looked up to. During her speech to the young women, Carla started having visions of young girls being physically and sexually abused, including a vision of a young girl in a cupboard. A crack of light came from under the door, and then loud footsteps came towards her, and the cupboard door was locking. To which a young girl stood up in floods of tears, claiming that she was the little girl in the coat closet. Then Carla had a second vision of someone being molested as a child by a relative, and a young deaf girl ran out of the auditorium straight into the bathroom, where she tried to drown herself in the toilet bowl. On the last day of camp, Franco said that she was asked by a counsellor to comfort and pray with Erica, and she claimed that while they were talking, God presented her with the word molestation. She said to Erica, quote, "You have been abused as a child, sexually abused," unquote. And Carla turned to a counsellor and said it was Erica's father and it had been going on for years. So this woman who claims to have a direct connection to God is telling these young, and in my opinion, gullible Christian women that horrific things had happened to them with no evidence whatsoever. But of course, these very religious young women are going to believe that this is true, because it is the word of God, after all. Erica at this time had also been gifted a book by her aunt. It was called Michelle Remembers. It was released in 1980, and it was co-written by a psychiatrist and his psychiatric patient, Michelle Smith. The book documents Smith's memories of events recovered during therapy, and it documented many satanic rituals that she believed that she was forced to attend. Michelle was just 5 years old when her mother offered her up to a cult of devil worshippers to be used demonically to raise Satan himself. Within a couple of months, both Erica and Julie left the Ingram home, and they didn't give their parents any explanation as to why. Erica eventually agreed to meet with her mother, Sandy, and she told her about the years of sexual abuse her father had subjected her to. She said that it was usually during the poker nights when Paul had his colleagues over. She said that her brothers had also been involved in abusing her, but the abuse finally came to an end when Paul joined the Pentecostal church in 1975. And when Sandy asked Erica why she didn't tell her any sooner, Erica replied, "Mum, I did tell you. I tried to tell you and you wouldn't listen." So Sandy goes home and she asks Paul what the fuck is up, and Paul denies everything, as does her son Chad. Yes, this is a hilarious name, but we just need to move past it, okay? Julie was later picked up by a local rape crisis centre, and she told the police that her father had been vaginally and anally raping her and Erica up until Julie was 15. So Erica was then called in by the police, and she told them that her abuse started when she was 5 years old. She said it continued up until she was in the 4th grade, which I believe is sort of around 10 years old. But she then went on to say that her dad gave her an STI only the year before, when she was 21, and she said that a local doctor had treated her for the infection. Erica also told police that Paul had been raping Julie for a very long time, and that Paul had actually gotten her pregnant and taken her to get an abortion. There are no records of the police further investigating the STI or abortion claims, which seems bizarre because doctors would keep records of those things, right? When Erica confided in other people about her allegations, she said that she thought her father would probably lose his job when people found out. So she clearly didn't understand just how serious these allegations against Paul were. After both girls were interviewed by the police, Paul was arrested on November 28th, which happens to be my boyfriend's birthday. Way! But unfortunately, it left Sandy jobless as she had to close down her daycare, and her daycare license was suspended whilst all children were questioned about Paul and if he had ever had any interference with them. And it was also Sandy's birthday the very next day. Poor bitch. When Paul was questioned, he denied all charges against him. Paul was then assessed by Richard Peterson, who was a psychologist. Richard explained to Paul that he couldn't remember abusing his daughters because it was likely that he had repressed his memories of it. He asked Paul if he too was sexually assaulted as a child, as he thought it was highly likely. And all Paul could remember was that his mum told him off once for scratching his crotch in public. Richard assured Paul that once he confessed to the crimes, his memories would come flooding back. Paul at this stage had progressed his career to the deputy sheriff, and he was aware of suppressed memories, and when someone does something really terrible, or has something really terrible done to them, they can bury that thing away in their mind like it never happened. The police presented Paul with a letter that his younger daughter Julie had written to a teacher to explain why she had been misbehaving and not quite herself. And this is what it said. My feelings about this whole ordeal are totally weird. Sometimes I feel good and sometimes bad. And then there are the days I feel totally confused and I just wish I could move to a different state and start life all over with new friends and no one would know about my past. And I have time mostly at night when I'm so scared. I don't sleep. I just wait in my room for my dad. I hate it. I will never enjoy sex. It hurts so bad and it makes me feel so dirty. Being a Christian, I suppose I have to forgive him for what he did and still does to me. But it's very hard. He also says things to me like, if you're a good girl, God will take care of you. And if you tell, you'll pay for it, I promise you. So according to Julie's letter, the abuse from her father had not stopped when she was 15, like she had previously stated. Her letter continued. I can remember when I was 4 years old. He would have a poker game at our house and a lot of men would come over and play poker with my dad. And then they would all get drunk and 1 or 2 at a time would come into my room to have sex with me. And they would be in and out all night laughing and cursing. I was so scared. I didn't know what to say or who to talk to. The weird thing is that Erica and I shared a room, and they never touched her because she would say something. And also at night, most of the time, she slept on the top bed, and I think my dad and all of his friends were afraid that the bed might break. So Julie's letter now implicated many more people than just her father, and it appeared to the police that there was an active sex ring operating in their station right under their noses. When detectives Brian Schoening and Joe Vokich, I'm quite certain that's how you pronounce those, brought this letter to Paul's attention, he said that he would never harm his children This isn't something that he could do. He wasn't capable of this. But he also said that he didn't bring up his children to lie. So I guess they must be telling the truth. And maybe there was a dark side to him that he had hidden away. Paul said that he couldn't remember his friends ever going upstairs to see the kids during poker games. Policeman Schoening said, "What we're talking about, Paul, is she was molested by somebody other than you. She even remembers being somebody tying her up on the bed and 2 people, at least, taking turns with her while someone else watched. Probably you." Paul's language and how he recalls events is very odd. He uses phrases like, "I just don't see anything," like he's trying to visualize something new rather than recall a memory of something that happened. Officer Vukic asked, "Is Jim Raby the person that she's talking about?" Paul replied, Just don't put words in my mouth. I'm trying to bring something up here. Jim's the only one that comes to mind." He's then asked, "In this picture you have, Paul, do you see ropes?" You've put the ropes there and I'm trying to figure out what I've got," said Paul. "It kind of looks to me like she'd be laying face down, kind of like she's hogtied." Because Paul was imagining all of these scenarios about his daughter, rather than remembering them, he came across as very detached and unbothered by what he was saying, which disturbed his colleagues questioning him who had worked with him for years. He is then asked to just relax. And Paul starts to give some details of a man standing next to him. He says that he can see him on his left. His penis is sticking up in the air. He can even read the time on the man's watch. Paul then says that there is a man on his right, a local mechanic called Ray Risch, who is holding a camera. During his entire interrogation, despite being an officer himself, Paul never once asked for a lawyer to be present, which just blows my mind. Police, of course, question the men that Paul is accused in his visions, and both Raby and Risch had the same conclusion as Paul. They didn't remember the events, but maybe they buried it. The police told Raby that they had photos of him laying naked with Julie, which was a lie. And they told Risch that Raby had implicated him in the events, which is also a lie. But what a coinkydink that all 3 men just happened to say, "I don't think I can do this. I'm not capable of it. But maybe I repressed it." If I was told that I was under suspicion of raping a child, I would know that I did not and would be absolutely flabbergasted at the accusation. But the fact that these guys are so quickly saying, "No, I wouldn't do that. Maybe I repressed it." It's just very odd. I don't know. Maybe there was a seminar recently to all of the police about repressed memories and I don't know, it was all fresh in their minds. I'm not entirely sure, but it's very bizarre. John Brayton was Paul's pastor, who would go on to use his holy confessions as evidence for the police. Pastor Brayton would tell Paul that God would not allow him to see visions that were untrue, which means that by his verdict, if I can visualize myself as a paedophile, then that must be true. God would not allow me to see anything untrue. Which, of course, is ridiculous, because do you count dreams in that theory? Because I have had some pretty wild dreams involving some pretty naked celebrities, and I'm very certain that they did, in fact, not happen, unfortunately. Paul asked Pastor Brayton to perform an exorcism to vanquish the demons from within him that were making him an evil man. He was told it wasn't demons, but spirits, including the spirits of sexual immorality and gluttony. Paul tried to vomit the spirits out into a bin, but with no luck. Paul then told the police of a vision of his friend Raby, anally raping his son Chad on another occasion. So the visions are really stacking up. And when confronted, Chad said that he'd never been sexually abused and that the claims were completely false. Paul's visions then started to escalate to robed figures and the devil kneeling around a fire where he was forced to sacrifice a black cat. The Satanic Panic was a collective of fears that consumed the US in the 80s and 90s. This was the time when Richard Ramirez was all over the news, sporting his pentagram on his palm and exclaiming his "Hail Satan" whilst he was in court. Along with the case of the West Memphis 3 in the 90s, in which 3 teenagers were wrongly convicted and imprisoned of homicide charges based on little more than the public's suspicion over their Gothic identities. Because goth does equal Satanist, after all, and we all know that all Satanists are animal sacrificing, blood drinking baby murderers. And I am of course being sarcastic. But speaking of murdering babies, Erica would further fuel the flames of satanic abuse a few years later after describing the time that she was carried out to a barn in the back garden where there was a high priestess, where she was surrounded by adults all dressed in gowns, with hats, with horns, and they would all chant, and the barn was covered in blood, and they would lay an 8-month-old baby on a table, and the adults would all stab the baby over and over until it died and then bury it in the ground. Although the admissions from Paul and his daughters were contradictory, investigators in the sheriff's department became convinced that they were dealing with the first case capable of finally proving that satanic ritual abuse existed, and that was huge. Meanwhile, back at home, Sandy was starting to question her own beliefs. Was this all going on under her nose without her knowing about it? She wrote a note to herself that read, "Questions to ask God. Has my life been a lie? Have I hidden or suppressed things, bad things that have happened in the past? Have I been brainwashed, oppressed, depressed, controlled without knowing it?" To make matters worse for Sandy, on her first visit to Paul, he had confessed to her about the affair that he had had 13 years before, and she was, of course, devastated. If she didn't see the affair, what else didn't she see happening in her home? A few days later, the police came to her home to tell her that she was now being investigated. Erica and Julie had changed their mind on their mother's involvement. They now claimed that Sandy would help to prepare them for the men's visits, and she would sit on the edge of the bed and watch during the photography sessions and the sexual abuse. Sandy was in shock and told the police that this was not true, and did the first smart thing that we've seen and called her lawyer, which of course prompted the officers to leave. Sandy was now terrified that her youngest son Mark would be taken away, which was not helped by Erica making anonymous calls to the police and reporting sexual abuse towards the youngest Ingram boy by his mother. The church now also shunned Sandy, and she was completely on her own. The police eventually tracked down the oldest son, who had left home several years before. Firstborn, Paul Ross, was not surprised to hear that his father had been arrested on sexual assault charges, and told the officers about a particular poker night. The door in his parents' bedroom was ajar, and he saw Sandy tied to the bed, with belts around her feet and what looked like stockings tying her arms to the bedposts. Jim Raby was screwing her, Schoning's report stated, and his dad had his dick in her mouth. Ray Risch and another man were to the left jacking each other off. His dad came over and hit him so hard that it almost knocked him out, and he yelled at his son that he was to leave them alone and closed the door. Paul Ross said he then got himself a fifth of whiskey, retreated to his room, and that was the night that turned him into an alcoholic. Paul Ross did not recall any sexual assault against his sisters, and he was never personally abused. So could it be that these poker nights were in fact nights for everyone to get a little frisky, have an orgy? I mean, we know that Paul and Sandy were sexually charged, and if they were involved in an open relationship like this, then it wouldn't surprise me if all the kids knew something was going on. No one's going to want to babysit, 5 kids, so it makes more sense to do it in the home than out the home. And it would make sense why Erica and Julie connected sex to the poker nights. Sandy did later go on to discuss this night with her pastor, and she couldn't quite recall it, but she started remembering other times when Raby was naked, howling on all fours like a dog, and another time where both Raby and Riche had anal sex with her. But the memories were hazy. And to me, it sounds either like she's making up these visions, or it could be that she may have been drugged by Paul, and then maybe him and his buddies would then have sex with her. And then maybe the girls too. I mean, I obviously don't know, but it crossed my mind and I thought it was worth a mention. Both sisters were now starting to refuse to talk anymore about the abuse that they had suffered, and this was going to cause the court quite the issue, as Riche and Raby's trial dates were fastly approaching, and they would need them to give statements in court. Both sisters appeared to be unreliable witnesses, and it was clear to the judge that there were many holes in the stories. Both sisters were then asked to verify their accusations of sexual abuse, abortions, and scarring with a physical examination. But when the exam was carried out, no evidence of abortions or sexual abuse were found. But the examiner did say that this was common, as it's hard to find evidence of sexual abuse unless it was particularly brutal. But Erica had stated that they were given coat hanger abortions, and one abortion was carried out with a sword. So I would imagine that that would leave some kind of lasting mark. Both girls were also found to have no other marks or scars on their bodies, which would surely be present after claims that they were repeatedly sliced with knives and pinned to tables with nails through their skin. After this examination didn't confirm any of the girls' claims, Erica then went on to write another shocking statement, and it read, "My father made me perform sexual acts with animals, including goats and dogs. He would bring the animals to me and have them perform oral licking to my genitals. Sometimes I was on my period, sometimes not on my period. Then my father would force me to have vaginal intercourse with the animals while he took photographs. My mother was also present and also had intercourse with the animals." Meanwhile, Raby and Riche were sticking to their claims of innocence, and there was no physical evidence to prove otherwise. Even Paul was starting to change his mind on what he had envisioned, and he pleaded not guilty in his first hearing. The prosecution had put together a deal for Paul so that if he did plead guilty to 9 counts of third-degree rape, in return, the prison time would be minimal, and there was a chance that Paul could walk out of the courtroom a free man. But he had to testify against his friends. The police then brought in Pulitzer Prize-winning social psychologist Richard Offshee, who was an expert on cults and mind control. Offshee said that the way Paul spoke alluded to someone who was lying or completely deluded, and he didn't believe Paul's memories to be true at all. But Paul told him that his pastor had assured him that God would only show him true visions, and had started practicing a relaxation technique that he had read in a magazine to help him recover his buried memories. Offshee then experimented with Paul's miraculous technique to recall his memories. Offshee alluded to a made-up situation that involved his son Paul Ross and his daughter Erica, and asked Paul to go back to his cell to pray on it. Nothing more was said, so he didn't say anything at all about, ooh, this happened or that happened. He was just like, maybe something happened between your son and your daughter. Who knows? A few days later, Offshee met with Paul, and he was handed a 3-page written confession which described him making Erica and Paul Ross have sex in front of him so he could teach them both how to climax. And he said he may have also had anal sex with his son afterwards, but he isn't sure. Paul told this confession as if he were a third party looking at the scenario. He would say things like, I see, I feel, it reminds me of, I hear, etc. So off she planted this idea in his mind, left him to pray and think it over, and he then produced a fully written confession including dialogue based on his imagination and visions that must be true because God would not allow him to see things if they were not true, right? So after off she spoke to the Ingrams, he concluded that Paul was highly susceptible. Paul's father even went on to say that he would often hypnotize Paul as a child to convince him to do the housework and get good grades. Like, what the fuck kind of parenting is that? Going out of your way to learn how to hypnotize your children? Off she also suspected that Erica was a pathological liar, and Julie just followed her older sister's lead. In February of 1989, both Raby and Rish had been released on tag and were told to stay at home. And to be honest, now that the word had gotten out about the satanic rituals, neither man would want to leave their home, as the community was in shock. Both men were offered plea deals. Say you're guilty and we'll reduce your prison time dramatically. But both men declined the opportunity and stated their innocence. The statement that made the case very questionable in the eyes of the Thurston County Sheriff's Department was when Paul said that a dog from the police canine unit had raped his wife. And there was a number of officers there that were involved. But the named officers had all taken lie detector tests that had come back to show that they were in fact not involved, and they suspected that Paul would be lying. Of course, as we know now that, lie detector tests just don't fly anymore, but the tests in the 80s and 90s could be submitted as evidence if needed. So I appreciate we are flip-flopping a lot here. So let's take a moment and just think. Are Erica and Julie telling the truth about their satanic abuse? Personally, I do not think that this has happened. I think that they have been emotionally scarred with being ignored by their parents and perhaps seeing them being openly sexual. And I think that the heart-to-heart camp where Carla planted the seed of molestation into Erica's mind was just the beginning of the end. God did tell Carla that it had happened, after all. Paul, on the other hand, is a wild character who could make all of this shit up. But surely he did. Off she planted a memory in him that never happened, and he then wrote a 3-page confession. And Julie and Erica, if they did make all of this up, it's just bonkers. Julie wrote to the judge overseeing the case and told them that her mother opened her vagina with pliers and put a dead baby's arm inside of her. What? What is happening? Who is making this up? It's just bizarre. On the 1st of May 1989, the trials of all 3 men were set to begin. All charges of satanic abuse were dropped, but Paul did plead guilty to 6 counts of third-degree rape after receiving letters from his daughters saying that he owed them that much at least. And third-degree rape is when you have sex with someone under the age of 17 years old, as they're incapable of giving their consent to consensual intercourse. So if a grown man was having a relationship with someone that was underage and the underage person said it was consensual, it would still be classified as third-degree rape. And I think that the reason that he got third-degree rape is that there isn't actually any evidence. It's just sort of the kids' names against his. But the sentencing was delayed after Julie received a threatening letter, and it read, "How's my very special little girl? Do you realise how much trouble you caused our family? You've really blown this one, and to tell you the truth, you've broken us up forever. You'll never be part of our family again. You've hurt your mum so bad. You've destroyed her. She wants to die. You do realise that there are many people that would like to see you dead, and a few that are hunting you. And it was signed, your ex-father, Paul. But the handwriting on the letter was very recognisable. And it was in fact Julie who had written the letter to herself. 2 days after Paul pleaded guilty to the 6 acts of third-degree rape, both Raby and Riche were released. 2 more months passed, and this gave Paul a long time to think while he was sat in his cell. And he started to categorise his memories. And he found that they were mainly under not so definitely happened and not sure. And he no longer believed that he was a Satanist or a child abuser. So Paul got himself a new lawyer and moved to revoke his guilty plea. But it was too late to make the change. All his lawyer could do was petition for leniency at the sentencing hearing, which was in April of 1990. At that hearing, Erica made a surprise appearance and asked that Paul be given the greatest possible sentence, as she believed that he would kill her and her sister Julie once he was released. Paul's last words to the court were, "I stand before you, I stand before God. I have never sexually abused my daughters. I am not guilty of these crimes." Paul was then sentenced to 20 years in prison. The following year, in December of 1991, Erica made an appearance on the popular daytime TV show, The Sally Jessy Raphael Show. She was joined by her aunt Robin, who said that she was in fact lying about everything. Her aunt Robin said that her brother Paul is a victim and Erica is emotionally disturbed and has been accusing men of rape since 1983. Robin says that Paul didn't realise quite how disturbed Erica was and that he had a hard time thinking that his children could lie. He was very naive. And back to the baby murders, Erica had drawn maps of the victims and the dead bodies, but when the police dug up the yard, there was no evidence to be found. When I watched the interview, Erica is very childish, saying that she won't look at her aunt because she doesn't like her, and her aunt has never seen her body, so how would she know if she had scars? Dr. Richard Offshee is also on the show, and he challenges Erica on the so-called scars, and Erica grins. She smiles at him, saying that she has loads of evidence, and she's been in the hospital many times, most of her life in fact, and is covered in scars. Paul was later released in April of 2003 when he was 57 years old, and the location and names of the Ingram family are unknown. It's believed that they got new names, moved out of Washington, and started new lives. But what happened in that Ingram household? All stories fight each other and contradict major and minor points. It's really hard to know who to believe, and I do think that Erica must have gone through some kind of trauma in her life, but I also wouldn't trust her as far as I could throw her based on the evidence I've read and the interview I watched on the Sally Jessy Raphael show. I completely understand that I have not come across as empathetic to Erica or Julie in this case, and it's not that I don't think that we should always believe the victim, because of course I do. But I knew the whole story, and it's hard for me to feign sympathy for these sisters because I just don't believe in what they said. What about you? Who do you believe? Is it possible that all of these things happened? It just all seems bizarre to me that all of this stuff happened with absolutely zero evidence. I don't know. I don't think it happened. I really don't. And if it didn't, Paul served 20 years in prison. But I don't bloody know. But let's take it back to the beginning. How is my summer punch and lemonade? Well, I'll tell you. It's got a kick to it, I'll tell you that. I don't even know what's in it. Summer punch with lemonade. What's it actually got? Oh, it's a sparkling summer punch flavour mixed drink with alcohol and lemonade. It's just got alcohol in it. No one knows what alcohol, but it's in there. It's quite nice. It's nice. It's cold. It's fruity. You know? I don't know what else to say. It's nice. It's currently 11:05 and I need to try and get this up by midnight. So, in this episode show notes, you will find the link to the 2-part article in The New Yorker, which was written by Lawrence Wright. And it's part 1 and part 2 of his book called Remembering Satan, which is where I got the majority of the information for this episode. I also watched a documentary called Paul, The Secret Story of Olympia's Satanic Sheriff by Nik Nerburn, and that will also be linked, as well as the episode of the Sally Jessy Raphael show. It's a YouTube link, but do be aware that it does cut off towards the end, so it's not the whole episode. You can find updates about new episodes over on Twitter and Instagram, and I will be sure to post the photos of this case over on the Instagram page. Both pages can be found under Ale and Agony. And if you want to support the show and you have some spare cash and you'd like to throw it at me and support the show, then you can come and find me on Patreon at patreon.com/aleandagony. And if you do, you can access some cheeky bonus content from time to time. I will be releasing a bonus Patreon mini-sode very soon on other cases of recovered memories, as there are some other very unusual cases out there to talk about. So sign up to access that bad boy. I, of course, would be super grateful for any feedback and any more of those cheeky 5-star reviews over on Apple Podcasts, because they really do help to bump me up the list of recommendations to people. And I thank you so much for spending this time with me. Well done on getting through to the end. We had a lot of bizarre things. We had, rape, baby murder. We had bestiality, all kinds of things, periods, great times. And I hope to catch you on the next episode. Goodbye, my friends.